Hi guys, tonight we begin a quiet journey into one of the most fascinating outlaw stories America has ever known. This is the tale of Bonnie and Clyde, a young couple who stepped out of ordinary lives and into legend. Their names became symbols of rebellion, danger, and romance, echoing across history long after their time. Together they carved a path through the Great Depression that the world would never forget. But before we begin, for those who enjoy slow, thoughtful stories about legendary figures, hit like, subscribe, and share in the comments which personality or historical figure you'd like me to cover next. And tell me, where are you watching from? I'm always curious to see the different places my viewers are from. It all began in the early years of the 20th century, long before the headlines and the myths. Clyde Chestnut Barrow was born in 1909. The fifth of 7 children in a struggling farming family from Ellis County, Texas. The Barrows were poor, moving from one patch of rented land to another, searching for a living in a time when money was scarce and opportunities were slim. By the time Clyde was a teenager, the family had settled in a rundown area on the edge of West Dallas, known as the Devil's Back Porch. It was a place where poverty, desperation, and petty crime mixed together, shaping the lives of those who grew up there. Clyde was small, wiry, and full of restless energy. From an early age, he dreamed of something beyond the limits of his surroundings. He loved music, especially the sound of a guitar, and often pictured himself as someone who could rise above the dirt roads and broken shacks that lined his childhood. But life had other plans. By the age of 17, he had already tasted trouble with the law, arrested for small thefts and for running with local gangs. Bonnie Parker's story began differently, though her world was just as fragile. She was born in 1910 in Rowena, Texas, and raised mostly in Cement City, a working-class neighborhood of Dallas. Her father died when she was very young, leaving her mother to raise 3 children alone. Despite hardship, Bonnie carried herself with charm and determination. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, with reddish blonde hair and a bright smile. Teachers remembered her as an intelligent and creative student, especially skilled with words and poetry. She had dreams of becoming a writer, or perhaps even an actress. At 16, she married her high school sweetheart, Roy Thornton, but the union quickly fell apart. Roy disappeared into his own criminal troubles, and Bonnie was left alone, still wearing his wedding ring even as the years passed. The world around them was changing in ways that would shape their fates. The 1930s had arrived with the crushing weight of the Great Depression. Banks collapsed, jobs vanished, and families across America faced hunger and despair. For some, crime became a desperate escape, a way to grasp at survival or thrill in a time when everything seemed lost. Newspapers filled with stories of robberies, shootouts, and bold escapes. Outlaws were both feared and admired, their names whispered like modern folk heroes. It was in this setting that Bonnie and Clyde's lives would finally cross. In January of 1930, through a mutual friend, Bonnie met Clyde at the home of a girl she knew. Accounts differ on the exact details, but most agree on one thing. From the moment they saw each other, the connection was instant. Bonnie was drawn to Clyde's confidence, his quick smile, and the spark of danger in his eyes. Clyde, in turn, was captivated by Bonnie's wit, her laughter, and her unwavering spirit. They came from worlds of hardship, but together they felt something electric, something larger than the boundaries of their lives. Neither could have known then how short their time would be, or how deeply their story would be etched into American history. What began as a chance meeting in a Dallas home would grow into a saga of robberies, prison breaks, wild escapes, and tragic endings. But for now, in those first days, it was simply 2 young people drawn together by fate, standing on the edge of something that would make them unforgettable. After their first meeting in January 1930, Bonnie and Clyde quickly found themselves inseparable, spending hours together and discovering a sense of belonging neither had felt before. For Bonnie, Clyde represented adventure and escape from the routine of waitressing and the quiet struggle of daily life. For Clyde, Bonnie was a light, someone who believed in him despite his flaws, someone who could see beyond the dirt roads of West Dallas. Yet fate had little patience for young love. Only weeks into their relationship, Clyde was arrested for a series of burglaries and sent to prison in March of that year. The separation was painful, and Bonnie remained devoted, visiting when she could, writing letters, and holding on to the promise that one day he would return to her. Clyde's time in prison hardened him in ways he'd not expected. He endured harsh conditions, including backbreaking labour and abuse from other inmates. In an act of desperation, he even injured himself by chopping off 2 of his toes, hoping to avoid further punishment. Ironically, he was paroled only days after, leaving him permanently crippled for no reason. The bitterness he carried out of prison would shape the course of his life. He no longer believed in rehabilitation or second chances. He believed only in survival and resistance against a system that he felt had betrayed him. When he walked free in 1932, Bonnie was waiting, ready to stand beside him no matter what path he chose. By then, the economic despair of the Great Depression had deepened, and law enforcement across the Midwest was stretched thin against waves of robberies, bootlegging, and organised crime. Clyde quickly slipped back into criminal life, joining with his brother Buck and other companions to form small gangs that targeted stores, gas stations, and later, banks. Bonnie was swept into this world, not always by direct choice but through her loyalty to Clyde. She was arrested once early on, in April 1932, during a failed robbery when Clyde managed to escape but Bonnie was caught. She spent several months in jail, writing poems and maintaining her spirit, until charges against her were dropped for lack of evidence. That brief imprisonment gave her a glimpse of what lay ahead, yet when released, she returned immediately to Clyde. By then, he was fully committed to a life outside the law, and she was determined to stand with him, no matter the cost. Their partnership, once tender and hopeful, was now bound together by shared defiance, hardship, and an unspoken acceptance that their journey would not be a long one. They were young, reckless, and deeply in love, and the road before them was already darkening with shadows of gunfire and pursuit. By early 1932, Clyde Barrow was no longer just a troubled young man trying to find his place. He was a marked figure in the eyes of Texas law. After his release from prison, he had sworn never again to return to a cell, and every choice he made reflected that vow. He gathered small groups of companions, men who drifted in and out of his orbit, each one seeking either easy money, a sense of belonging, or simply the thrill of rebellion. Clyde preferred quick robberies of small stores and gas stations over large banks, believing that smaller crimes carried less risk and attracted less attention. But the constant pursuit by police made even these petty acts dangerous. Bonnie, now firmly beside him, accepted the risks as part of the bond they shared. She became not only a companion but also a lookout, a driver, and an emotional anchor. Despite the growing dangers, their relationship deepened in the stolen moments between escapes. Quiet dinners by campfires, shared laughter on dusty roads, and the unshakable certainty that they belonged together against the world. In August of that year, Clyde reconnected with his older brother Buck, who had just been released from prison. Buck and his wife Blanche briefly tried to pull Clyde toward a more stable life, but Clyde was already too far gone. Together, the brothers planned robberies that carried them across Texas, Oklahoma, and Missouri. Each success brought them a little money, but also drew the net of law enforcement tighter. In one attempted robbery, things turned violent, and Clyde shot at officers, cementing his reputation as not just a thief, but a dangerous criminal. This escalation changed everything. Newspapers began to mention his name, sometimes paired with Bonnie's, framing them as a daring young couple who defied the law. For Bonnie, the attention was both frightening and strangely intoxicating. She wrote poems about their life on the run, capturing the mix of love, loyalty, and looming doom that defined their days. Still, beneath the romantic aura lay exhaustion and constant danger. They slept in stolen cars, abandoned barns, or cheap roadside cabins, never staying long enough to be traced. Hunger, fear, and the sound of sirens were constant companions. Yet every morning they chose each other again, convinced that their love was worth the price. What neither of them realised was how quickly the myth of Bonnie and Clyde was beginning to outgrow the reality, shaping them into larger-than-life figures while they were still very much alive and very much hunted. By 1933, the story of Bonnie and Clyde was no longer just a tale whispered in the neighbourhoods of Dallas. It had begun to spill across state lines, turning them into names recognised in every sheriff's office from Texas to Missouri. Clyde's determination to avoid prison at any cost meant that his crimes grew bolder, his choices sharper, and his gun quicker. The Barrow Gang, as they came to be called, shifted constantly in size and makeup. Sometimes it was just Bonnie, Clyde, and a companion. At other times, Buck and Blanche joined, turning the group into a restless travelling family. Each member carried their own fears and loyalties, but it was Clyde who set the pace, and Bonnie who held the role of unshakable partner. Their daily existence was a rhythm of theft, hiding, and narrow escapes. Automobiles became their lifeline. Clyde had a reputation for his skilled driving, weaving through country backroads at speeds that left lawmen far behind. They relied on fast cars, especially the Ford V8, which Clyde often praised for its power and reliability. These cars were not just vehicles, but symbols of freedom, allowing them to vanish into the horizon after each heist. Yet the price of this freedom was relentless exhaustion. They rarely slept in the same place twice, surviving on stolen food, cold meals eaten in shadows, and the brief comfort of roadside cabins. Bonnie, despite her loyalty, began to feel the toll. In one incident, a car accident left her with severe burns on her leg when a vehicle overturned and caught fire. For months afterward, she struggled to walk, often needing Clyde's help. Yet even in pain, she refused to leave his side. The injury marked her permanently, but her resolve only seemed to harden. Law enforcement, meanwhile, grew more coordinated. The Texas Rangers, sheriffs, and federal agents began to pool resources, trading information across states. Reports of the gang's movements filled newspapers, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes fabricated, but always captivating to a public weary of Depression-era hardships. To many struggling families, Bonnie and Clyde were symbols of rebellion against banks, institutions, and authority. To police, they were dangerous criminals who left bodies in their wake. By spring of 1933, the gang rented a small apartment in Joplin, Missouri, hoping for a moment of rest. It was there that they briefly lived like ordinary people, cooking meals, laughing together, and even taking photographs that would later become infamous. Those pictures, showing Bonnie with a pistol and Clyde with his hat tipped low, would spread across America, cementing their image as glamorous outlaws. But their attempt at normalcy could not last. A shootout with police in Joplin ended with 2 officers dead and the gang narrowly escaping, abandoning most of their possessions. Among the items left behind were the very photographs that would turn them into legends, faces staring from newspapers across the nation. From that moment on, Bonnie and Clyde could no longer fade into the background. They were marked as fugitives, hunted day and night, their faces etched into the public imagination as the outlaw couple who defied the world. The events in Joplin marked a turning point, for the photographs left behind did what years of thefts and small robberies never could. They gave Bonnie and Clyde a public identity. Until then, they had been drifting names in police reports, figures who might have been forgotten like dozens of other petty criminals in the Depression years. But when the newspapers printed Bonnie Parker's playful pose with a cigar in her mouth, and Clyde Barrow's hard stare beneath his hat, the couple became something larger than themselves. People saw not just criminals, but characters, symbols of daring youth who laughed in the face of authority. The photographs shocked lawmen who expected faceless thugs, not a woman in stylish clothes and a young man who could have been anyone's neighbour. For the public, starved for stories of escape and defiance, Bonnie and Clyde suddenly appeared glamorous, even romantic. At the same time, those closest to the chase knew the reality was far darker. In the Joplin shootout, officers had died, and the Barrow Gang had proved they would not hesitate to pull triggers. The myth was spreading, but behind it lay blood, fear, and constant danger. After Joplin, the gang moved quickly, crossing state lines to stay ahead of the law. Blanche Barrow would later write in her memoirs that life on the run was a blur of sleepless nights, nervous meals, and endless fear. She described Bonnie trying to bandage her burned leg while Clyde scouted for food and fuel, and how laughter was often forced, a thin veil over the gnawing awareness that their time was running short. The group robbed banks, though often clumsily, and struck at small-town stores. These robberies rarely made them rich, sometimes yielding only a handful of dollars, yet each act added to their notoriety, feeding headlines that exaggerated both their wealth and their violence. The reality was more pitiful than grand. They were often broke, hungry, and worn down, relying on stolen clothes or handouts from sympathetic families who viewed them as rebels against a system that had left many impoverished. Police records from the period show a string of murders tied to the gang, mostly officers caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Clyde's vow never to return to prison meant that he would rather shoot than surrender. Bonnie, though often romanticised as a gun-wielding outlaw, rarely fired a weapon. Witnesses noted she was usually a passenger, often holding her injured leg, yet her presence beside Clyde made her equally guilty in the eyes of the law. By the summer of 1933, they were exhausted but still defiant, drifting from hideout to hideout, clinging to each other as the world closed in. They were no longer simply running from police. They were running from the inevitability of their legend, one that was being written in headlines faster than they could live it. By late summer of 1933, the Barrow Gang's life on the run had become even more desperate, shaped by the injuries, close calls, and relentless pursuit that shadowed them every day. After the shootout in Joplin, they never again enjoyed even a brief moment of stability. Clyde pushed the gang into constant movement, driving through the night across back roads, through small towns, and into states where they hoped lawmen were slower to recognize them. Their stolen cars became both their home and their shield, filled with stolen license plates to swap whenever suspicion grew too close. For Bonnie, the lingering burns on her leg continued to limit her mobility. She leaned on Clyde's help, often requiring him to carry her short distances when the pain flared, yet she refused to abandon him. Her determination impressed even their companions, who sometimes questioned whether her loyalty was courage or blind devotion. Still, Bonnie wrote poems during these dark stretches, scribbling verses about fate, love, and the doomed course of their lives, capturing emotions that no headline could. Blanche, travelling with her husband Buck, was less hardened to the chaos. She longed for normalcy, often pleading with Buck to leave the gang and find a quiet life. But Buck, torn between loyalty to his brother and his wife, continued to follow Clyde into the storm. Their world grew more dangerous in July when the gang attempted to hide out at a rural park near Platte City, Missouri. Law enforcement tracked them down, and what followed was one of the most intense gun battles yet. In the chaos, Buck was severely wounded by a bullet to the head, and Blanche was nearly blinded by glares from a shattered window. Despite the carnage, Clyde managed to drive them to safety, speeding away while blood and smoke filled the car. They hid in Iowa, but Buck's injuries were too grave. After days of suffering, he died, and Blanche was captured, her story later becoming one of the most vivid personal accounts of life inside the gang. For Clyde, the loss of his brother was a devastating blow, though he rarely showed grief outwardly. He hardened further, convinced that there was no turning back and no chance of escape except through death. Bonnie, though heartbroken, tightened her bond to him, becoming his only constant companion. Newspapers relished every detail of the Platte City shootout, painting the gang as ruthless killers while also fueling public fascination with Bonnie's presence. Some readers saw her as a tragic figure, others as a dangerous woman who chose love over morality. In truth, she was both, wounded, loyal, and carried by the momentum of Clyde's choices. As 1933 turned to 1934, the Barrow Gang was no longer a band of drifting outlaws. It was Bonnie and Clyde against the world, and every mile they travelled felt heavier, marked by the ghosts of those they had lost and the inevitability of the road ahead. As the year 1934 began, Clyde Barrow's name had become synonymous with danger across the Midwest, and Bonnie Parker's image had been permanently fixed beside his. Their faces stared from wanted posters tacked to courthouse walls, gas stations, and post offices. Rewards for their capture climbed steadily, and lawmen across multiple states were ordered to shoot on sight. Yet, in the midst of this storm, Bonnie and Clyde carried on as if the warnings belonged to someone else. Clyde had grown increasingly strategic in his planning. He studied the habits of rural police, noted the fastest back roads between towns, and relied on stolen cars with the best horsepower to give him an edge. For a time, this constant motion kept them one step ahead. Bonnie, though struggling with her injured leg, became skilled at navigating maps, marking safe places to stop and scrawling notes about areas where lawmen seemed most active. She and Clyde worked like a unit, their survival depending on unspoken trust. It was during this period that Clyde began to set his sights on more dangerous ambitions. He believed that striking directly at prisons and law enforcement would not only help free old friends, but also send a message that he could not be controlled. In January 1934, he staged a daring raid on Eastern Prison Farm in Texas, a place he knew well from his own painful time behind bars. With a small group, Clyde ambushed guards and broke out several inmates, including his close associate Raymond Hamilton. The raid was a shocking act, carried out with precision, and it cemented Clyde's reputation as someone who would stop at nothing to humiliate the system that had once crushed him. For Bonnie, the raid revealed just how far they had gone. She wrote poems reflecting on the choices they had made, describing in cryptic lines the life they now lived, a road with no return, where each sunrise promised only another narrow escape. But even as they succeeded in freeing allies, the cost was clear. The Texas prison system was outraged, and powerful officials vowed to end the Barrow Gang once and for all. Among those called to action was Frank Hamer, a former Texas Ranger with a long history of hunting dangerous fugitives. Hamer was quiet, relentless, and respected by fellow lawmen. Once placed on their trail, the hunt for Bonnie and Clyde shifted from chaotic pursuit to a methodical campaign. Clyde, sensing the growing pressure, pressed harder, leading to more robberies and violent encounters that left blood in their wake. The Eastern raid had emboldened him, but it had also lit a fire under the very system he despised. By the spring of 1934, Bonnie and Clyde were both infamous and doomed, their names etched into history not as small-time outlaws, but as the ultimate fugitives, racing down roads that seemed to grow narrower with every passing mile. The Eastern Prison Raid in January 1934 was both Clyde's boldest success and the beginning of the end. By freeing prisoners under heavy guard, he struck directly at the institution he hated most, but in doing so, he brought the full weight of Texas law onto his trail. The newspapers sensationalized the story, describing the outlaws as daring masterminds while printing photographs that turned them into household names. To the public, Bonnie and Clyde became larger-than-life figures, romanticized by some as rebels against a broken system, condemned by others as ruthless killers. For law enforcement, however, there was no romance left, only a mission to stop them permanently. Frank Hamer, the former Texas Ranger, accepted the task. Unlike many who had failed before, Hamer was patient and analytical. He began studying the gang's movements, their habits, and their patterns of travel. He noticed that Clyde favoured state borders, often using them to confuse jurisdiction and slow down pursuit. Hamer also understood that Clyde's devotion to Bonnie meant they would never split, no matter how desperate their circumstances became. As Hamer mapped out their world, Bonnie and Clyde carried on with their restless journey. Their daily existence was bleak despite the myths forming around them. They ate cold meals in their car, slept in hidden corners of woods or roadside ditches, and endured the growing weight of suspicion in every town they passed. Bonnie's injured leg made walking difficult, yet she remained by Clyde's side, her spirit unbroken. Witnesses often described her as quiet, rarely speaking during robberies, though her presence was undeniable. She symbolised loyalty, and in the eyes of many she transformed Clyde from a lone outlaw into part of a tragic, inseparable pair. During these months, robberies became more violent. In several encounters, police officers were shot, and each death hardened the resolve of those hunting them. Clyde, true to his vow, refused to surrender, and the moment a lawman drew near, the guns came out. This pattern of violence ensured that mercy was no longer possible for either of them. The gang's numbers thinned as arrests and deaths claimed companions. Friends drifted away, unwilling to share in the inevitable fate. By spring, Bonnie and Clyde were alone more often than not, driving endlessly through dusty roads in stolen cars, bound together by love, fear, and the knowledge that their story could end at any moment. Yet even in this darkness, they found fleeting moments of peace. Sometimes Clyde played his guitar by a fire, and Bonnie recited her poetry, lines that spoke of fate, love, and the quiet acceptance of doom. These rare glimpses of tenderness kept their bond unshaken, but they also deepened the sense that theirs was a road already written, one that would lead them straight into legend. By the spring of 1934, Bonnie and Clyde were no longer simply fugitives moving from robbery to robbery. They had become the focus of a carefully organised hunt led by Frank Hamer. He travelled across Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and beyond, studying their every move, collecting testimony, and speaking with officers who had once faced the outlaws and lived to tell about it. Unlike earlier pursuers who relied on luck and scattered information, Hamer built a methodical picture of their habits. He noted how they preferred small towns, how they clung to back roads rather than main highways, and how Clyde always kept a powerful car ready with extra license plates and stolen weapons. For all the myths that surrounded them, their reality was one of exhaustion and constant fear. They lived out of their car, their possessions limited to weapons, clothing, and a few personal items. Bonnie's injury from the earlier car accident continued to trouble her, forcing her to walk with difficulty, but her resolve never faltered. In public memory, she became the image of unwavering loyalty, a woman who would rather face bullets than abandon the man she loved. Their robberies during these months were smaller and more desperate, often yielding only a few dollars or some food, yet each one added fuel to their reputation. Headlines continued to exaggerate their exploits, painting them as glamorous and rich, when in truth they were often broke and surviving on stolen bread or canned goods. Despite the hardships, Bonnie continued to write, producing poems that revealed her awareness of their doomed fate. In one, she described how their love would carry them until death, and how the world would remember them not as criminals but as legends who defied authority. These writings, discovered after her death, later deepened the aura of tragedy around her name. Meanwhile, Hamer tightened the net. He learned that Bonnie and Clyde remained tied to family despite their flight, occasionally returning in secret to see relatives or to drop off money. This loyalty gave him a trail to follow, watching farmhouses and back roads, waiting for signs of the couple. Every mile the fugitives travelled brought them closer to the inevitability of ambush. Yet Bonnie and Clyde pressed on, unaware of just how closely their hunters were watching. In those final weeks of freedom, they laughed together, sang songs, and shared dreams of a future that could never be. Their world had shrunk to the size of their car, the endless roads before them, and the bond that kept them side by side even as the shadow of their end grew darker each day. As April 1934 unfolded, the relentless chase of Bonnie and Clyde grew heavier. The roads they once sped down with confidence now lined with suspicion, and the invisible presence of Frank Hamer's quiet pursuit. By then, Clyde had developed a routine that seemed unbreakable, stealing cars, swapping plates, and slipping into rural areas where lawmen were slow to react. He believed his driving skills and quick planning would always grant him an escape. But what he did not see was how closely Hamer had come to understanding every habit, every pattern, every blind spot. Bonnie, though tired and often in pain from her lingering injuries, remained devoted. She scribbled poems about fate, often reflecting a deep sense that their story was racing toward a violent conclusion. In her words, she accepted that love had bound her to Clyde, and that no amount of lawmen or bullets could change that bond. At times, she gazed out from the passenger seat, the countryside rushing past, and spoke of ordinary things, what it might have been like to live quietly, to have a home, or to write a book. Clyde listened, but his silence told her that he no longer believed such dreams possible. Their robberies had grown less rewarding, sometimes taking only a handful of coins or a few loaves of bread, yet they carried a weight in the public's imagination that far exceeded the reality. Newspapers painted them as millionaires on the run, living in luxury and terrorizing entire regions. The truth was far sadder. They were worn, often hungry, and living on the edge of despair, yet held together by loyalty that neither poverty nor danger could sever. By this time, many of their companions were gone. Some had been captured, some had been killed, and others had simply walked away, unwilling to face certain death. It was now, more than ever, just Bonnie and Clyde against the world, alone in a whirlwind of dust, sirens, and gunfire. Hamer, tracking them with patience, understood that desperation would soon drive them into mistakes. He also knew that family ties were their greatest weakness. Despite all warnings, Bonnie and Clyde could not resist the pull of kinship, sometimes visiting relatives in secret, sometimes sending small gifts or money. It was during these moments that Hamer placed his trust, watching closely, knowing that love of family might reveal the final clue. For Bonnie and Clyde, each visit carried the sweetness of reunion, but also the shadow of betrayal, as though the very roads leading to family homes were lined with fate itself. The closer they drew to those ties, the nearer they came to the point where escape would no longer be possible. Yet in their car, with the windows down and the spring air rushing past, they clung to each other, speaking of tomorrow as though it might still arrive, even as destiny prepared to meet them around the bend. By May of 1934, the final weeks of Bonnie and Clyde's journey were unfolding with a strange mixture of routine and inevitability. Their days were spent in constant motion, driving across dusty back roads, pausing only to rest in hidden fields or to refuel with stolen gasoline. Clyde's skill behind the wheel remained his greatest weapon, allowing them to slip past police traps and vanish into the countryside. Bonnie, though weakened by her injury, sat beside him with determination etched into her face. She knew as well as he did that the road was narrowing, but she never let fear replace loyalty. Together they shared brief moments of tenderness amid the chaos, reading poetry, humming songs from the radio, or simply holding hands as the horizons stretched endlessly ahead. Their legend had outgrown their reality. In the newspapers, they were portrayed as glamorous desperados, living in reckless wealth and firing pistols at every turn. In truth, their car was cluttered with scraps of food, dirty clothing, and weapons that were more necessity than choice. They were exhausted, hungry, and burdened by the knowledge that lawmen would show no mercy. Still, the myth of Bonnie and Clyde continued to captivate a public struggling through the Depression. To some, they were symbols of defiance, striking back at banks and authorities that had failed ordinary people. To others, they were dangerous killers whose crimes left families mourning fallen officers. The truth was somewhere in between, a tangled web of desperation, rebellion, and youthful devotion. Frank Hamer's patience was beginning to pay off. He had charted their routes, followed their patterns, and most importantly, identified their unbreakable link to family. Clyde could not stay away from relatives for long, and Bonnie's devotion to her own kin pulled her back to familiar places as well. Hamer and his small posse of lawmen positioned themselves carefully, waiting for the couple to appear. They knew that once the chance came, it would be sudden, violent, and final. Meanwhile, Bonnie and Clyde dreamed of escape, even as the net closed tighter. They spoke of Mexico, of running far enough south to disappear, or of finding a quiet farm where no one would search. But each dream collided with the reality of their faces on wanted posters and the relentless pressure of the law. On lonely nights, Bonnie recited her poems to Clyde, lines that carried both love and resignation. She foresaw their fate. describing how they would go down together, their story etched into memory. Clyde, hardened and silent, rarely spoke of such endings, but his eyes betrayed the truth. He knew their journey had only one possible conclusion. The spring of 1934 carried them closer with each passing day, the roads narrowing, the choices shrinking, and the legend of Bonnie and Clyde moving ever nearer to its final chapter. As the middle of May 1934 approached, Bonnie and Clyde's lives had shrunk into a constant cycle of travel, hunger, and narrow escapes. The couple clung to their stolen Ford V8 as if it were both fortress and home, its powerful engine carrying them across the plains and forests of Texas and Louisiana. Inside the car, their world was reduced to essentials: a pile of stolen guns, a few maps marked with back roads, scraps of food, and the fragile comfort of each other's presence. Bonnie's injured leg still troubled her, yet she insisted on helping with navigation, keeping a sharp eye on road signs and listening for distant sirens. Clyde, ever alert, pushed the car at speeds that terrified passengers but thrilled him, confident that no officer could match his skill behind the wheel. Despite the hardships, moments of intimacy still appeared. Bonnie recited her poems in the quiet hours, verses that mixed love, loyalty, and an almost prophetic acceptance of their fate. Her words often spoke of dying together, of being remembered not as criminals but as lovers bound by destiny. Clyde, hardened by years of struggle, rarely shared such thoughts, but his silence was its own form of agreement. He had long understood that their story could not end in capture or prison. Only death awaited them, and he intended to face it on his terms. Frank Hamer and his posse, meanwhile, continued to trace their every move. Hamer knew patience was the key. He studied family ties, certain that Bonnie and Clyde's devotion to their loved ones would eventually betray their position. Relatives received secret visits, brief moments of reunion that carried both joy and danger. Each stop left a trail for Hamer to follow, a pattern slowly tightening into a trap. The myth of the outlaw couple continued to swell in the public's imagination. Ordinary people, weary from the Depression, read newspaper accounts that portrayed Bonnie and Clyde as folk heroes who mocked authority. Children collected clippings, couples whispered about them, and ballads began to circulate. Yet behind the myth stood the harsh truth of gunfire, grief, and the endless chase. Officers had died, families mourned, and the couple themselves lived in exhaustion, far from the glamorous legends painted in headlines. Still, their bond endured. In the dim glow of dawn, they shared stolen breakfasts on the hood of their car. In the evenings, they laughed softly, recalling childhood memories and dreaming of impossible futures. Each mile they travelled bound them tighter together, even as it brought them closer to their inevitable end. The spring air was thick with both beauty and doom, the roads lined with wildflowers that seemed to mark a path into history. Bonnie and Clyde pressed onward, unaware that within days, the chase that had defined their lives would reach its final violent conclusion. The final days of Bonnie and Clyde's journey unfolded with an eerie quiet, as though the world itself was holding its breath. By late May 1934, their circle of allies had diminished to almost nothing, and the pair moved like shadows across the Louisiana back roads. Their Ford V8 carried them through small towns and farmland, its growl announcing their passage, but few dared to interfere. Fear and fascination surrounded their names, and while some locals whispered of offering food or shelter, most stayed silent, knowing that association meant danger. Bonnie's health had worsened. Her injured leg limited her movements, and the endless travel left her exhausted. Still, she refused to show weakness, leaning on Clyde's arm when needed, and masking her pain with sharp humour and loyalty. She wrote verses in her notebook, foreseeing the violent end that loomed ahead. "Someday they'll go down together," she had written, lines that would later seem hauntingly prophetic. Clyde, meanwhile, remained focused, his eyes always scanning the road, his mind fixed on escape that he must have known was impossible. He spoke little of death, but his actions betrayed acceptance, keeping weapons within reach, checking his car with obsessive care, and pushing forward with reckless speed. Their world had shrunk so small that only the two of them remained: the car, the road, and the bond that nothing could break. Frank Hamer and his posse were closing in. After weeks of study and pursuit, Hamer had mapped the couple's movements and recognised the pattern that bound them to family. He learned that Bonnie and Clyde planned to visit the family of Henry Methvin, a gang member who had aligned himself with them. This connection offered Hamer his opportunity. He and his men set up an ambush on a quiet rural road near Gippsland, Louisiana, waiting in the brush with rifles ready. The stage was set, though the couple driving toward it had no idea their time had run out. In the days before, Bonnie and Clyde still found fleeting moments of tenderness. They shared stolen meals, laughed at small jokes, and leaned on each other as if nothing beyond the horizon mattered. To the world they were outlaws, dangerous and hunted. To each other they were simply Bonnie and Clyde, bound by love and defiance, writing the last lines of a story that would soon be sealed in gunfire. The myth had already been written in newspapers, but the reality, the exhaustion, the hunger, the endless road, belonged to them alone. Each mile they drove brought them closer to the ambush waiting in silence, rifles aimed at the car that had carried their legend. The morning of May 23rd, 1934, began like countless others for Bonnie and Clyde, though the air carried a heaviness that neither could name. They were driving through rural Louisiana, heading toward a rendezvous with Henry Methvin's family, unaware that betrayal had already sealed their fate. The road they travelled was narrow and lined with tall pines, the kind of road Clyde preferred because it offered cover and quick exits. Bonnie sat beside him, her notebook tucked away, her thoughts lost in the rhythm of the journey. She had long sensed that their story would end violently, and yet she clung to the simple presence of Clyde at her side, refusing to let fear outweigh love. Clyde, focused as always, kept his hands tight on the wheel, scanning the horizon with the alertness of a man who trusted nothing but his own instincts. But instincts can be deceived, and on that morning, Frank Hamer and his posse of 6 lawmen lay hidden in the brush, rifles loaded, hearts steady, waiting for the familiar sound of Clyde's Ford V8. They had been there since before dawn, positioned on the narrow road after convincing Methvin's family to lure the outlaws into their trap. For hours the silence stretched, broken only by the rustle of wind in the trees and the occasional nervous shift of a rifle in waiting hands. Then, shortly after 9 o'clock, the growl of the Ford reached their ears. The lawmen raised their weapons as the car appeared in view, moving steadily down the road. Clyde's eyes were fixed on the path ahead, unaware of the danger concealed only yards away. Bonnie leaned forward slightly, perhaps speaking softly, perhaps humming as she often did on long drives. In that instant, the myth of Bonnie and Clyde still lived. 2 lovers bound against the world, chasing a freedom that had always been just out of reach. The ambush erupted with sudden fury. Without warning, the rifles roared, sending a hail of bullets into the car. Clyde was struck first, his head snapping back as the engine shuddered. Bonnie screamed, though her voice was lost beneath the thunder of gunfire. The car lurched, slowed, and then was torn apart by the storm of bullets. The posse fired relentlessly, determined to leave no chance of escape. In less than 30 seconds, the legend ended in an explosion of sound and smoke. The couple cut down together as Bonnie had once written they would be. When the guns fell silent, the car rolled to a stop, riddled with holes, its windows shattered, its passengers motionless. The outlaws who had defied the law, who had captured the imagination of a nation, were gone. Yet even in death their story was only beginning, for the world would seize on the images of that morning and carry their names forward into legend. When the gunfire ceased on that warm Louisiana morning, the silence that followed was almost unbearable. The Ford V8, once Clyde's prized machine of escape, sat motionless, riddled with more than 100 bullet holes. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air, mingling with the faint scent of pine drifting from the woods. Frank Hamer and his posse slowly approached, their rifles still trained on the shattered vehicle, unwilling to believe that Bonnie and Clyde were truly finished until they saw the stillness with their own eyes. Inside the car, Clyde slumped behind the wheel, his head resting awkwardly, the life gone from his once sharp eyes. Beside him, Bonnie's body leaned against the door, her hand outstretched as if still reaching for him even in death. The scene was brutal, but it was also strangely quiet, the violence already fading into the stillness of history. Within hours, word of the ambush spread like wildfire. Locals rushed to the site, some out of curiosity, others to claim souvenirs from the infamous car. People cut locks of Bonnie's hair, tore pieces of her dress, and pried shell casings from the ground as keepsakes. The line between crime scene and spectacle blurred, reflecting the fascination the public held for the outlaw lovers. Reporters arrived quickly, snapping photographs that would soon appear on front pages across the nation. The images of the bullet-riddled Ford and the lifeless bodies inside shocked and captivated the public. For some, justice had finally been served. For others, the tragedy of two young lives cut short underscored the cost of desperation in hard times. As the car was towed into town, crowds gathered, straining for a glimpse of the fallen outlaws. In Gippsland, Louisiana, the tiny community found itself overwhelmed as lawmen tried to control the surge of onlookers. The bodies were transported back to Texas, where thousands came to view them, lining up for hours just to witness the final chapter of a story that had gripped the country. Bonnie and Clyde's deaths marked the end of an era, not only for law enforcement, but for a public that had projected its fears, hopes, and fantasies onto the couple. In life, they had been both admired and despised, their images twisted by newspapers into something larger than reality. In death, they became legends, their names forever tied to the Depression years and to the notion of lovers bound against the world. The car, riddled with holes, became an icon itself, displayed in fairs and exhibits, a grim reminder of the day myth met reality in a storm of bullets. And as the dust settled, one truth remained. Bonnie and Clyde had lived and died together, exactly as Bonnie once wrote in her haunting poetry, leaving behind a legacy that would endure long after the smoke cleared from that lonely Louisiana road. The aftermath of the ambush revealed just how deeply Bonnie and Clyde had embedded themselves in the American imagination. As their bodies were transported back to Dallas, crowds of mourners, curiosity seekers, and opportunists gathered in the thousands, filling the streets in numbers usually reserved for parades or political rallies. At Bonnie's funeral, nearly 20,000 people came to pay their respects, lining up to glimpse her coffin, leaving flowers and handwritten notes, some treating her as a tragic heroine rather than a criminal. Clyde's funeral was no less overwhelming, with mourners and gawkers alike flooding the area, their emotions tangled between fascination, pity, and condemnation. Both were buried separately, despite Bonnie's lifelong wish that they rest together. Their families, scarred by the ordeal and worn by years of public attention, could not agree to bury them side by side. Even in death, they remained symbols of defiance, their separation in the grave adding a bittersweet note to their legend. Newspapers capitalized on the story with relentless energy, filling front pages with photographs of the bullet-riddled Ford, the still figures inside, and the lawmen who ended the chase. Headlines carried both triumph and sorrow, celebrating the end of a violent spree while acknowledging the strange allure the couple held for the public. Editorials debated their meaning. Were Bonnie and Clyde victims of circumstance, shaped by the cruelty of the Depression, or were they simply ruthless killers whose myth had outgrown the truth? That debate would linger for decades. Souvenir hunters carried away pieces of their legacy. Strands of Bonnie's hair, stolen at the scene, were sold as relics. The Ford V8 itself became a travelling exhibit, displayed at carnivals and state fairs, drawing lines of visitors who marvelled at the car that had carried America's most infamous lovers to their end. Inside, the seats were stiff with dried blood, a grim reminder of the violence that ended the legend. For law enforcement, The ambush was a victory, proof that persistence and cooperation could bring down even the most elusive criminals. Yet for many ordinary people, the story felt like the closing of a chapter that had captured their imagination during years of struggle. Ballads were written, poems circulated, and whispers passed through towns about the courage or the foolishness of two young lovers who had dared to take on the world. Bonnie's own poems were printed in newspapers, her words now seen as prophecy. Lines such as, "Someday they'll go down together," echoed with haunting accuracy, cementing her voice as part of the legend. Clyde's reputation, shaped by his vow never to return to prison, painted him as a man whose defiance had cost him everything but won him immortality in story. Together, their myth was larger than life, and in the weeks that followed, Bonnie and Clyde were no longer merely outlaws. They had become American folklore, woven into the cultural fabric as symbols of reckless love, doomed rebellion, and the strange way tragedy can turn into legend. In the weeks following their deaths, Bonnie and Clyde's legend seemed to grow faster than ever, as if the violence of their ending had only fueled the imagination of a weary nation. Magazines and newspapers printed elaborate retellings of their crimes, often exaggerating details to make the story even more sensational. Some papers described Bonnie as a gun-toting killer, despite evidence that she rarely fired a weapon, while others portrayed her as a tragic figure swept into Clyde's world by love and circumstance. Clyde, meanwhile, was painted as both ruthless murderer and misunderstood rebel, a man whose vow never to return to prison turned him into a symbol of defiance. Families who had lost loved ones to the gang mourned bitterly, reminding the world that behind the myth were very real victims, officers and civilians whose names were often lost beneath the glare of Bonnie and Clyde's fame. Yet the public, caught between condemnation and fascination, continued to elevate the pair into near-mythical figures. Ballads were sung in small towns, recounting their adventures in a tone that blurred the line between truth and folklore. In taverns and on porches, people argued whether they had been heroes or villains, whether their actions were born of desperation or cruelty. The Great Depression gave their story special weight. Banks had foreclosed on countless farms, jobs were scarce, and resentment toward authority ran deep. For some, Bonnie and Clyde represented rebellion against a system that had failed them. For others, they were cautionary figures, proof of how far despair could lead when mixed with violence and recklessness. Meanwhile, lawmen like Frank Hamer were both praised and criticised. Some hailed him as the man who finally ended the reign of terror, while others questioned the overwhelming firepower used in the ambush. Hamer himself rarely spoke at length about the event, preferring silence to the noise of public debate. The car in which they died continued to draw crowds wherever it was displayed, serving as both macabre curiosity and tangible reminder of their fate. People lined up to see the bullet holes, to imagine the final moments of the outlaw lovers, and to take photographs that tied them in some small way to the legend. Families passed down stories of how they had once glimpsed Bonnie and Clyde, or knew someone who had. Each retelling stretched the truth, but with every exaggeration the myth grew stronger. Their legacy had escaped the confines of reality, entering a realm where fact and fiction blended seamlessly. By the end of 1934, Bonnie and Clyde were no longer just names on wanted posters. They were etched into American folklore, symbols of passion, rebellion, and the thin line between love and destruction. As the years passed after 1934, the memory of Bonnie and Clyde continued to ripple across American culture, refusing to fade into silence. Families who had lived through the Depression carried the memory of the Outlaws as both warning and legend, and children grew up hearing tales that blurred fact and myth. In many retellings, Bonnie became more than a partner in crime. She was transformed into a symbol of fierce loyalty, a woman who chose love above all else. Her poems, published after her death, gave her a voice that lawmen could not silence. Lines like, "They don't think they're too smart or desperate," echoing through print as if she had written her own epitaph. Clyde, hardened by life and by his refusal to bend to authority, became the embodiment of defiance, a young man who fought against a system he felt had broken him, though his fight had no victory in the end. Together their image grew romanticised, especially in the decades that followed, when popular culture began to reshape their story for new audiences. Songs were written that told of their daring robberies, stage plays were produced, and later films would reimagine their lives with a mixture of glamour and tragedy. To a public that longed for stories of passion and rebellion, Bonnie and Clyde offered both, their deaths turning them into martyrs of a doomed romance. Yet historians who examined their lives reminded readers of the harsh truth, that beyond the myth were real crimes, real victims, and a trail of grief left in their wake. Officers gunned down in small towns, store clerks traumatised by robberies, and families left without fathers or sons were also part of the story, even if headlines chose to emphasise the drama of the outlaw couple. The duality of their legacy became permanent, Bonnie and Clyde as both symbols of love against the odds, and as criminals who paid the price for their choices. Communities in Texas and Louisiana preserved memories of their passage, with some locals claiming that their parents or grandparents had once given the couple food, shelter, or directions, each story adding to the aura of myth. The bullet-riddled Ford V8, preserved and displayed for decades, became almost a relic, drawing curious visitors who marvelled at the holes and imagined the final scene on that quiet Louisiana road. Even in death, Bonnie and Clyde travelled, carried by culture, memory, and fascination. They had lived only briefly, their careers as outlaws spanning just 2 years, yet their legend promised to last far longer, echoing in ballads, stories, and debates over what they truly represented. In many ways, they had become less people and more symbols, their humanity overtaken by the legend that grew larger with each passing decade. By the 1940s, only a few years after their deaths, Bonnie and Clyde had already become characters in the folklore of America, woven into the same fabric that carried tales of Jesse James and Billy the Kid. Their story, however, was distinct in its modernity. Unlike the gunfighters of the Wild West, Bonnie and Clyde belonged to an age of automobiles, highways, and mass media. Their legend had been born not only from their deeds, but also from the photographs, headlines, and ballads that carried their faces into every corner of the nation. Newspapers continued to revisit their saga, publishing anniversary articles that retold the ambush and speculated on the deeper meaning of their brief and violent lives. For families who had endured the Depression, the story remained a mirror of the times, an era when poverty pushed some toward desperation, and when rebellion against authority could take root in unlikely places. Clyde's defiance against prison life and Bonnie's loyalty, crystallised in her poetry, became touchstones for storytellers. Schoolchildren whispered about them in classrooms, and young couples sometimes invoked their names as shorthand for reckless love. In these retellings, the harsher truths of robbery and murder often softened, replaced by an almost romantic script where 2 young dreamers fought a system too powerful to escape. Meanwhile, historians and lawmen who had lived through the events worked to preserve the truth. Frank Hamer, though largely silent, became a legendary figure in his own right, his role in ending Bonnie and Clyde's spree etched into the lore of Texas Rangers. Other officers who had faced the gang spoke at length about the dangers of myth-making, warning that fascination with criminals too easily overshadowed the pain of victims. Yet fascination proved stronger than caution. Folk singers carried the tale into ballads, their verses travelling from radio to taverns, painting Bonnie and Clyde as tragic rebels whose love burned brighter than law could extinguish. By mid-century, Hollywood began to take interest, planting the seeds for films that would later immortalise their names in ways the real Bonnie and Clyde might never have imagined. What kept the legend alive was not just the violence of their end, but the intimacy of their bond. The image of Bonnie leaning toward Clyde in photographs, the sight of them sharing cigarettes or laughing with companions, reminded people that beneath the outlaw veneer were 2 young souls bound by love. That combination of intimacy and defiance proved irresistible, ensuring that long after the smoke cleared from their final ambush, their story would live on in memory, in song, and in the cultural imagination of America. By the 1950s, the legend of Bonnie and Clyde had settled firmly into the American consciousness, no longer just a story of crime, but a tale retold in music, books, and whispers across small towns. As veterans returned from World War II and the nation shifted into a new era, people still remembered the Depression years when poverty and desperation had driven some down dangerous roads. In that memory, Bonnie and Clyde remained symbols of rebellion, a reminder of how youth and circumstance could collide in ways that left history forever changed. Ballads circulated across the South and Midwest, often sung in roadside diners or at local gatherings, where verses painted the outlaws not as ruthless killers, but as tragic lovers who dared too much. These songs glossed over the violence, instead highlighting the devotion that had kept them side by side until the very end. At the same time, writers began to take a deeper interest in separating myth from fact. Biographers interviewed surviving relatives, lawmen, and townsfolk, piecing together details of the chase, the robberies, and the ambush that ended it all. Some accounts sought to strip away the romance, emphasizing the crimes and the victims left behind, while others leaned into the legend, framing Bonnie and Clyde as symbols of passion and defiance. In Texas and Louisiana, locals preserved stories of encounters with the couple, tales passed down from parents and grandparents. A farmer might claim his family once gave them a meal, or a shopkeeper might recall hearing their names whispered in fear. These personal anecdotes added texture to the larger narrative, each one blurring the line between memory and imagination. Meanwhile, the physical relics of their lives continued to fascinate. The bullet-riddled Ford was displayed at carnivals and fairs, drawing crowds eager to glimpse the grim remains of history. Visitors leaned close to count the bullet holes, imagining the fury of gunfire that had torn through metal and flesh. Some left with a sense of justice, others with sorrow, but all left with the impression that Bonnie and Clyde were more than mere criminals. They were legends carved into steel and memory. The 1950s also saw America grappling with new cultural shifts, from rock and roll to the stirrings of civil rights movements, and in that context, Bonnie and Clyde's story resonated anew. They were seen by some as precursors to a rebellious spirit that challenged authority and sought freedom at any cost. Their love, reckless and doomed, provided a timeless theme that storytellers returned to again and again. In this way, their legacy continued to evolve, not frozen in the dust of 1934, but alive in the voices, songs, and imaginations of those who found in their story something that spoke to the restless heart of America. By the 1960s, the story of Bonnie and Clyde was poised for a dramatic revival. While historians and balladeers had kept their memory alive for decades, it was popular culture, especially film, that would transform their tale into something larger than history itself. In 1967, Hollywood released the movie Bonnie and Clyde, directed by Arthur Penn and starring Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway. The film was not a simple retelling of events. It was a cultural explosion. It framed the outlaw lovers as rebellious, glamorous, and sympathetic, blending violence with romance in a way that shocked some audiences and thrilled others. The movie sparked controversy for its graphic violence, but it also redefined Bonnie and Clyde for a new generation. Suddenly, they were not just Depression-era outlaws, they were icons of youthful defiance, standing in for the restless energy of the 1960s. The film's success was staggering, influencing fashion, music, and even politics. Faye Dunaway's portrayal of Bonnie with her beret and stylish clothes became a trend, while Warren Beatty's Clyde embodied charm mixed with danger. Critics debated whether the film romanticized crime, but its impact was undeniable. It earned Academy Awards, ignited conversations about violence in media, and etched Bonnie and Clyde deeper into cultural mythology. For many young viewers, the couple's doomed love story felt like a mirror of their own struggles against authority and tradition in a rapidly changing world. Meanwhile, scholars reminded the public of the historical reality. articles and books appeared, pointing out the stark difference between the film's glamorous narrative and the truth of exhausted fugitives living in cars, stealing for survival, and leaving behind victims of their choices. Families of slain officers protested the romanticisation, insisting that their loved ones' sacrifices not be overshadowed by Hollywood storytelling. Yet, as often happens, the myth proved stronger than the facts. The film cemented Bonnie and Clyde as cultural figures on par with Romeo and Juliet, except with guns and fast cars, their names now shorthand for reckless passion. Across America, people revisited their story with fresh eyes, some seeing tragedy, others rebellion, but few indifferent. The 1960s had found in Bonnie and Clyde an echo of its own turbulence, and in doing so, had guaranteed that their legend would not fade into the quiet pages of history, but continue to thrive, reshaped by each generation to reflect its own restless desires. In the years following the 1967 film, Bonnie and Clyde's legend took on an entirely new dimension, crossing from the realm of historical memory into the language of popular culture. The movie had elevated them into global icons, and with that exposure came an endless stream of references, parodies, and reinterpretations. Their names became shorthand for reckless love and defiance, invoked in songs, novels, and even advertisements. Musicians across genres wrote about them. Folk singers celebrated their tragic romance, while rock bands used their imagery to capture rebellion and danger. Even in hip-hop decades later, Bonnie and Clyde would appear as a symbol of loyalty between partners, a code for unwavering devotion against all odds. This cultural afterlife gave the couple an immortality they could never have imagined during their brief years on the run. Yet alongside the glamorization, historians and writers worked tirelessly to restore balance. New biographies emerged, drawing on police records, family testimonies, and first-hand accounts. These works sought to remind audiences that the couple's story was not simply one of love, but also one of crime, suffering, and violence. They highlighted the grief of families who had lost lawmen, the fear in small towns where robberies erupted, and the exhaustion Bonnie and Clyde themselves endured. This tension between myth and reality became part of their enduring appeal. Each generation seemed to mould them into whatever figures it needed: heroes, villains, lovers, or warnings. In Texas and Louisiana, their legacy remained especially vivid. Museums displayed artifacts connected to their lives: Bonnie's personal letters, Clyde's weapons, and photographs that once shocked the nation. The Ford V8, scarred by bullet holes, travelled from exhibit to exhibit, a grim centrepiece that drew crowds of the curious. Visitors marvelled at the physical evidence, trying to reconcile the romance of the legend with the brutality of the reality. Scholars noted that their fame revealed something unique about America itself, a fascination with rebels who challenge authority, even when those rebels are flawed or destructive. Theirs was a story about love, but it was also a story about the boundaries of society, the consequences of poverty, and the allure of defiance. By the 1970s, Bonnie and Clyde had become timeless archetypes, invoked not just in retellings of their own saga, but in entirely new stories that borrowed their essence. They had transcended their own history, their legend no longer bound to the dusty roads of the 1930s, but carried forward into the imagination of a world that seemed unable to let them go. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Bonnie and Clyde's names had become so deeply ingrained in American and even global culture that they were no longer viewed only as historical figures, but as enduring archetypes. Couples compared themselves to Bonnie and Clyde as a way of signalling loyalty and rebellious love, a devotion that stood against the odds. Their story was cited in music lyrics, novels, and theatre, shaping a cultural shorthand that often had little to do with the real people who once drove the dusty back roads of Texas and Louisiana. Hollywood's film had ensured that their imagery, stylish clothes, stolen cars, fast getaways, and doomed passion, was burned into the collective imagination. Yet during this period, there was also a growing interest in peeling back the layers of myth. Historians published more grounded accounts, drawing on interviews with surviving family members, law enforcement officers, and townsfolk. Blanche Barrow's memoir, written years earlier, gained renewed attention, offering a personal view of what life inside the gang had truly been like. Her words described exhaustion, fear, and hunger, elements often missing from the romanticised retellings. These works painted a picture not of glamorous outlaws, but of frightened young people constantly on the move, rarely secure and often desperate. Still, the myth had taken on a life of its own. In popular music, Bonnie and Clyde were transformed into metaphors. Country songs framed them as tragic lovers, while emerging rap artists used their names to represent unbreakable loyalty between partners who stood together against the world. The phrase "ride or die" was often linked back to them, evidence of how their story continued to resonate with themes of loyalty, rebellion, and passion. The bullet-riddled Ford, displayed in casinos and tourist attractions, remained a physical magnet for visitors. Thousands stood before the shattered glass and torn metal, imagining the final ambush, feeling the eerie presence of history made real. For some, it was a sobering reminder of violence. For others, it was a brush with legend. Families who had lost loved ones to the gang, however, reminded the world that this fascination carried a cost. They called for balance, urging people not to forget the officers who had been killed in roadside shootouts. This push and pull between reality and legend only deepened the complexity of Bonnie and Clyde's legacy. By the 1980s, they were figures who could not be neatly defined. They were at once criminals and lovers, symbols of defiance and cautionary tales of reckless youth. Their legacy was alive precisely because it could be moulded into so many shapes, each reflecting the needs and desires of the generation retelling the story. Whether in songs blasting from radios, academic books stacked in libraries, or the hushed conversations of tourists gazing at the Ford, Bonnie and Clyde continued their long journey into myth, their story refusing to fade even half a century after their deaths. By the 1990s, Bonnie and Clyde had crossed yet another threshold, evolving from historical figures and cultural icons into global symbols instantly recognised even by those who knew little of their actual story. Their names were invoked in advertising campaigns, fashion lines, and countless pop songs, where they represented passion, risk, and rebellion. The phrase, "like Bonnie and Clyde," became a shorthand for couples who stood together no matter the odds, often ignoring the grim reality of their lives on the run. Films, television specials, and documentaries revisited their saga, some leaning into Hollywood glamour, others trying to balance myth with fact. Each portrayal reshaped the legend for a new generation, ensuring that the outlaw lovers never truly left the public stage. In classrooms, history teachers used their tale to illustrate the desperation of the Depression years, a reminder of how economic hardship, injustice, and personal choices could collide with deadly consequences. Scholars highlighted Clyde's early struggles, his brutal prison experiences, and his vow never to return, framing his descent into crime as part of a broader story of poverty and failed rehabilitation. Bonnie's voice, preserved through her poetry, fascinated readers, her words lending a sense of tragic inevitability to their end. Museums across Texas and Louisiana began to see more visitors eager to trace the footsteps of the couple, studying artifacts, letters, and photographs. The bullet-riddled Ford remained a major attraction, displayed in casinos and tourist spots, its presence both thrilling and unsettling. Standing before the glass-pocked doors and torn metal, visitors often whispered of the violence it had witnessed, their imaginations replaying the ambush on a quiet Louisiana road decades earlier. Yet amid the fascination, the debate continued. Were Bonnie and Clyde simply reckless criminals, or were they shaped into legends by a media hungry for spectacle? Families of slain officers continued to push back against the glamorization, reminding the public that each ballad, each film, each love song tied to the couple risked erasing the memory of real lives lost. Still, the allure proved impossible to erase. In literature, they appeared as metaphors for youthful defiance. In music, they were immortalized as symbols of loyalty and passion. And in fashion, Bonnie's beret and slim dresses, Clyde's sharp suits, echoed across decades as timeless emblems of style fused with danger. The 1990s, with its explosion of media and global interconnectedness, ensured that their names reached audiences far beyond America. From Europe to Asia, people who had never set foot in Texas knew the legend of Bonnie and Clyde, proving that their tale of doomed love and rebellion had transcended its roots, becoming a universal story about youth, passion, and the costs of defiance. By the early 2000s, Bonnie and Clyde had achieved a strange immortality, their story continuing to evolve as technology and media reshaped the way people consumed history and myth. The rise of the internet gave new life to their saga, with websites, forums, and digital archives devoted to dissecting every detail of their lives. Enthusiasts pored over photographs, police reports, and Bonnie's handwritten poems, while others debated endlessly about whether the couple were victims of circumstance or cold-blooded criminals. The digital age allowed their story to spread to younger generations who had never read Depression-era newspapers or seen the original film, yet who recognized their names instantly as shorthand for reckless passion. Pop culture in the 2000s amplified their legend further. Musicians across genres, from country to hip-hop, invoked Bonnie and Clyde as metaphors for loyalty, risk, and devotion, often focusing more on their love than their crimes. Famous duets turned their names into symbols of romantic defiance, recasting the couple as modern icons of ride-or-die partnership. Fashion magazines occasionally revived their aesthetic, showcasing Bonnie's beret and skirts or Clyde's sharp suits as timeless emblems of rebellion wrapped in style. Meanwhile, historians continued their mission to balance fact with legend. New biographies were published, carefully separating exaggeration from truth, reminding readers that Bonnie and Clyde's lives were marked not by glamour, but by exhaustion, poverty, and violence. These works highlighted the devastating impact on law enforcement families, whose stories were often overshadowed by the myth. Museums curated detailed exhibits with artifacts like weapons, letters, and clothing, giving the public a chance to confront the human reality behind the legend. The bullet-riddled Ford V8 remained perhaps the most haunting relic of all, displayed under heavy protection, as crowds lined up to see the grim evidence of history. For many, standing before that shattered vehicle was like standing at the crossroads of myth and reality, a place where love, crime, and death converged in steel and glass. The internet age also gave rise to conspiracy theories, with some questioning the details of the ambush or speculating about betrayal among their companions. Others explored the psychology of the couple, debating whether Bonnie was truly an active participant or drawn into Clyde's orbit by circumstance. These digital discussions, though often speculative, proved the enduring power of their story. By the end of the decade, Bonnie and Clyde were no longer bound to the pages of dusty history books. They were cultural touchstones, invoked in songs, films, lectures, and online debates across the globe. Their story remained both tragic and captivating, a reminder that love and defiance, once fused together, can echo far beyond the brief lives that created them. As the 2010s unfolded, Bonnie and Clyde's presence in popular culture only deepened, proving that their legend was far more durable than the brief span of their actual lives. Streaming platforms and cable networks commissioned documentaries that revisited the couple's story with newly uncovered photographs, enhanced audio recordings, and interviews with historians. These programs sought to strike a careful balance, exposing the realities of robbery and murder, while still acknowledging the undeniable fascination of their romance. Viewers, however, often gravitated toward the emotional narrative, the image of two young lovers who chose loyalty over safety, even in the face of inevitable death. This decade also brought a wave of cultural reinterpretations. Musicians across the world continued to invoke Bonnie and Clyde in lyrics, sometimes as metaphors for survival in harsh environments, sometimes as shorthand for unbreakable bonds in love or friendship. Hip-hop artists, in particular, embraced the imagery of ride or die, linking it to themes of resilience, loyalty, and defiance against authority. Pop singers reimagined their saga in ballads that emphasized tragedy and devotion, while fashion designers staged photo shoots that echoed Bonnie's beret and Clyde's sharp suits, blending vintage style with modern edge. Academic circles revisited their story too, analysing it not just as history, but as cultural myth-making. Scholars examined how the media of the 1930s had amplified their fame through sensational photographs and headlines, and how the 1967 film had reshaped them into archetypes of youthful rebellion. Papers debated the ethics of glamorizing figures who had left real victims behind, weighing the importance of remembering both the human cost and the cultural significance. Museums expanded their exhibits, offering interactive experiences where visitors could explore maps of the Barrow Gang's travels, read reproductions of Bonnie's handwritten poems, and even sit inside a replica of their infamous Ford V8. Tourists flocked to Texas and Louisiana towns associated with their saga, eager to stand where history had unfolded. Local economies in turn benefited from the enduring fascination, yet with each retelling, the same paradox remained. Bonnie and Clyde were at once criminals and legends, both condemned for their choices and admired for their devotion. By the end of the 2010s, social media had carried their names into memes, hashtags, and viral posts, ensuring that their story reached audiences who might never have opened a history book. The myth adapted seamlessly to digital language, proof that even in an age of endless information, people remained captivated by tales of doomed romance and rebellion. Bonnie and Clyde, though long gone, continued to ride the highways of imagination, forever young, forever defiant, their story echoing across platforms and generations. As the 2020s began, nearly a century after Bonnie and Clyde's deaths, their legend showed no sign of fading. If anything, the digital age expanded their reach farther than ever before. Streaming services released dramatized series that explored their lives in long form, blending historical fact with modern storytelling techniques. Podcasts devoted entire seasons to dissecting their saga, interviewing historians, descendants of lawmen, and even relatives of the Parker and Barrow families. These narratives often highlighted the gap between reality and myth, reminding listeners that beneath the romantic veneer lay the harsh truths of exhaustion, crime, and constant fear. Yet audiences continued to be drawn not only to the historical details, but to the universal themes: love, loyalty, and rebellion against authority. Social media amplified the legend further. On platforms where brevity ruled, images of Bonnie leaning with a pistol or Clyde in his fedora circulated endlessly, accompanied by captions about loyalty and defiance. Hashtags like Ride Audi and Bonnie and Clyde trended periodically, with users applying the names to modern relationships, often without knowing the full story behind them. In this way, the couple's legacy became a flexible metaphor, detached from the specifics of their crimes yet alive as a cultural shorthand. Musicians of the decade continued to invoke them. Pop stars released ballads evoking doomed romance, rappers used their names to symbolize unbreakable partnerships, and even electronic artists sampled verses from Bonnie's poetry, transforming her words into haunting refrains layered over modern beats. Fashion too revisited their imagery, with designers staging campaigns that drew on the sleek yet rebellious style of the 1930s gangsters. Meanwhile, historians worked to keep the truth visible. Books published in this decade emphasized the pain left behind by the Barrow Gang's violence, telling the stories of lawmen and civilians who had suffered. Museums and cultural centers hosted exhibitions that balanced myth with memory, using interactive technology to guide visitors through both the legend and the lived reality. The bullet-riddled Ford remained a centerpiece, still drawing crowds who marveled at its battered steel, the relic standing as a silent witness to history's intersection of love and violence. Debates about morality and glamorization persisted, especially in classrooms and academic journals. Was it right to continue romanticizing figures whose choices had destroyed lives? Or was the fascination itself part of the human need to find meaning in stories of rebellion and passion? These questions ensured that Bonnie and Clyde's legacy remained not just entertainment, but a living conversation about culture, justice, and the way society remembers. Nearly 90 years after their ambush, their names carried weight far beyond the dirt roads of Louisiana, proving that legends, once born, rarely die. They adapt, change, and live again in the imagination of every generation. As the century mark of their deaths drew nearer, Bonnie and Clyde's story entered a new phase of reflection, where historians, artists, and ordinary people alike questioned why the pair continued to fascinate long after the bullets fell silent on that Louisiana road. Documentaries released in the early 2020s examined the roots of the legend, pointing to the unique moment in history when their tale unfolded. The Great Depression had left millions hopeless. Banks and institutions were viewed with suspicion, and newspapers hungry for spectacle transformed two young fugitives into household names. This environment, scholars argued, created the perfect conditions for Bonnie and Clyde to become symbols larger than life. Yet even with this understanding, the emotional pull of their story endured. Viewers still responded to the image of a couple so loyal that nothing, not poverty, not violence, not even death, could separate them. Writers explored the psychological dimensions of their relationship, asking whether Bonnie's devotion was born of love, desperation, or a mix of both, and whether Clyde's defiance was courage or simply a refusal to face the consequences of his choices. Plays and novels reimagined their saga, sometimes placing them in alternate histories, sometimes using them as metaphors for modern struggles. In classrooms, teachers used their story to spark discussions about the power of media in shaping perception, showing how a few photographs and headlines could cement an image more enduring than reality itself. Meanwhile, the artifacts tied to their lives continued to attract attention. The Ford V8, riddled with bullet holes, remained one of the most famous crime relics in America, drawing crowds who peered through its shattered windows with a mix of awe and unease. Museums displayed Bonnie's handwritten poems, Clyde's weapons, and personal items, each object carrying the weight of history and legend entwined. Popular culture still invoked their names in songs, films, and television shows, with new generations discovering them not as dusty figures from the past, but as symbols of intensity, rebellion, and doomed romance. On social media, countless posts paired their images with modern captions about loyalty and passion, detaching them further from their historical context, yet ensuring their relevance. The paradox persisted. Bonnie and Clyde were both real people, flawed and violent, and cultural constructs reshaped endlessly by each era. In the 2020s, this paradox became central to their legacy. They were no longer judged solely as criminals or admired only as lovers. They were recognized as a mirror, reflecting society's fascination with danger, devotion, and the thin line between justice and myth. Nearly 90 years after their deaths, their story remained alive not because of what they did, but because of what people continued to see in them. As the 2030s drew closer, Bonnie and Clyde's story stood as one of the rare tales from the Depression era that had not faded into distant memory, but instead continued to evolve with each passing generation. Their legend was no longer just about who they were, but about what they had come to represent in the cultural imagination. For some, they were still the reckless criminals whose robberies left victims in their wake. For others, they had become symbols of defiance against authority, avatars of love so fierce that it outlasted bullets and time itself. Academics described them as American archetypes, figures who embodied the nation's contradictory relationship with freedom, violence, and romance. New biographies published during this decade leaned heavily into psychological analysis, exploring Clyde's vow never to return to prison and Bonnie's choice to bind her fate to his. These studies emphasized their humanity, pulling away the glamorous veneer to reveal two young people shaped by poverty, trauma, and circumstance. Yet even as the truth resurfaced, the myth remained indomitable. Popular culture refused to let them go. Music videos, television dramas, and even fashion campaigns continued to borrow their imagery, presenting Bonnie and Clyde not as history, but as timeless metaphors. The beret, the pistol, the Ford speeding into the horizon. These images carried weight even for audiences who knew little of the actual events of the 1930s. Social media gave their legend new forms, with countless memes, quotes, and reinterpretations spreading across platforms. Couples compared themselves to Bonnie and Clyde, not to celebrate crime, but to symbolize loyalty and passion. Their names became part of everyday language, detached from their origins yet always resonant. In towns connected to their history, tourism endured. Small museums curated artifacts, guided tours traced their final roots, and locals shared stories passed down through generations. Standing in the places where the Barrow Gang once hid, or where the final ambush unfolded, visitors often remarked on the surreal blend of history and legend. The bullet-riddled Ford remained a centerpiece, a haunting relic that continued to draw lines of curious travellers. Meanwhile, ethical debates persisted. Families of lawmen killed by the gang urged for remembrance of the victims, cautioning against too much romanticisation. Historians echoed the warning, reminding audiences that Bonnie and Clyde's choices brought real harm. Yet this tension, between truth and myth, sorrow and fascination, was precisely what kept the story alive. By the cusp of a new century since their deaths, Bonnie and Clyde were more than historical figures. They were cultural symbols reshaped by time, mirrors reflecting America's enduring fascination with rebellion, romance, and the price of living outside the law. Nearly a century after the final gunfire echoed on that Louisiana road, the story of Bonnie and Clyde endures as one of the most powerful legends in American history. Their tale has transcended the simple facts of robberies and ambushes, becoming instead a cultural mirror that reflects how society views love, rebellion, and justice. Scholars continue to study their lives, not to glorify their crimes, but to understand the forces that shaped them. The Great Depression, the failures of the prison system, the hunger for survival, and the pull of loyalty that bound two young souls together. Their faces, frozen in black and white photographs, still feel alive. Bonnie with her sly smile and Clyde with his determined stare. These images remind us that they were not just myths, but real people, flesh and blood, who laughed, wept, and dreamed even as they ran toward their tragic fate. The ambush that ended their lives remains one of the most famous in law enforcement history, studied for its strategy and criticized for its brutality. The car that carried them to their end has become an artifact of fascination, its bullet holes etched as permanent scars of legend. Tourists continue to gather around it, whispering about the moment when love and violence collided in a storm of lead. Popular culture has ensured their immortality. From the ballads sung in the 1930s to the 1967 film that redefined them for a generation, from the countless songs that invoke their names to the social media posts that still pair them with hashtags of loyalty, Bonnie and Clyde have become universal shorthand for devotion against all odds. They live in music videos, in fashion, in novels, and in the imaginations of those who see in them not criminals, but tragic lovers who refuse to be separated. Yet alongside the myth, the truth still lingers. Families of fallen officers remind us that behind the legend were real victims, lives cut short by the gang's choices. Historians emphasize that the couple lived in fear and hardship, that their reality was far from glamorous, and that their story should not be stripped of its consequences. It is this duality that keeps the legend alive, the tension between romance and reality, love and violence, admiration and condemnation. In the end, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow achieved what neither could have imagined in their brief, desperate lives. They became timeless. Their story continues to be told not just because of what they did, but because of what they came to symbolize. They remind us of the human longing for freedom, the danger of rebellion, and the enduring power of love that defies even death. And so, though the road ended for them in 1934, their journey has never truly stopped. In every song, every film, every whispered retelling, Bonnie and Clyde ride again, forever young, forever defiant, forever bound together in legend.